Good evening to everyone in the room. Your host for the day is Anshika Channa, a student at BML Munjal University in Gurgaon. I'd like to welcome you all to the Propel Pitchfest23 Masterclass series. So, the Adult Community Innovation Center ACIC of BML Munjal University and Propel Incubator have created a platform called Propel Pitchfest23 to support fresh concepts, inventions, and emerging startups. It enables interactions between startups and influential members of the ecosystem, including investors and entrepreneurs. This year, startups participating in the event will have to access to a $1 million USD financing pool. Well, we are eager to get going. So, I am very pleased to share that our masterclass third will be targeted towards de-jargonising term sheets. Before we commence our masterclass, I would like to introduce you to our speakers for the day, Ms. Ridhima P. Murjani and Ms. Gauri Khanna. So, Ridhima ma'am is a part of the corporate practice of the firm and has extensive experience in domestic and cross-border venture capital transactions, private equity transactions, merger and acquisitions, and exit transactions, etc. Clients that she has represented and advised include Policy Bazaar, Delivery Limited, Sleepy Owl, BECO, Burn Technologies, and several others. Gauri ma'am, too, has been a part of the corporate practice of the firm and primarily works on venture capital and private equity negotiation, transactions, documents, and closure. Drafting, reviewing, and negotiating transaction document and closure of the transactions. Client advice by Ms. Gauri include Delivery Limited, Lonova, Smart Paddle Technology, just to name a few. So the session commences. So I hand it over to you, ma'am.
Thanks, Anshika, for your kind words. We have a presentation ready as well. We'll just quickly project the screen. Allow us a moment. Is our screen visible? And are we audible? Is our screen visible to everyone?
The screen is visible and you are audible, ma'am.
Okay, great. So, just to hi everyone, good afternoon. I hope everyone's had their cup of tea and coffee. So, in this session, what we plan to do is to walk everyone through the basics of a term sheet. We're of course focusing on a PEVC, a private equity venture capital term sheet for this particular session. As is common in I think most all commercial documents, there are certain lingos which are used more commonly. The concepts very specific, limited to a transaction or a VC transaction. There is also some key terminologies which become relevant to understand upfront, to know that what from a founder perspective and what from a company perspective are we agreeing to. So the idea for this session is to let everyone know that these are the key terms how best can we navigate our obligations from, and when I say our obligations, I mean how best can we navigate obligations, undertakings, certain rights, certain restrictions from a founder, from a promoter perspective, and from a company perspective as well. I have Ridhima also with me, and we both will be taking everyone through the session. And the idea is to have this as an interactive session. Of course, Q&As can be taken up later. But if there are any thoughts that anyone has in between, please feel free to chip in, and we can, of course, discuss any particular questions that you may have. A very quick background about our firm. We are both principal associates at some partners. It's a full service law firm. We have offices in Delhi, Bombay, Chennai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, so all major cities in India. Our firm, while it focuses primarily on PE investments, VC investments, we have advised clients on both ends of the spectrum. So from an investor perspective as well, we've represented almost pretty much big names in the market. We also represent companies and promoters through their entire funding life cycle, and of course, from starting from pre-series rounds to the IPO stage, we've always been involved with our clients fully. We've, as I mentioned, our prime focus is on PEVC. In the PEVC practice, and we've extensively advised clients across various stages of funding. So with that, we'll start the session. In terms of understanding what is a term sheet, will anyone like to let us know what is their perception of a term sheet, what all should be included in a term sheet? Happy to hear your thoughts on this.
Hi, my name is Akshay. Am I audible to you?
Hi, Akshay. Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so basically when we talk about term sheet, it's a sort of agreement between either a VC or an angel investor and the founders of the organization that talks about the different terms that would be included for this, partnership where, the equity will be changed for the amount of money. There are multiple terms that includes like you can say, even exit strategies, the cash flow details, how finances will be managed if, one of the members would be allotted to the board from the VC firm and things like these.
So Akshay, you're right here. So the first document that parties really enter into before they start a transaction is a term sheet. It's typically a non-binding document which sets forth the basic framework, which includes both your commercial and legal terms of investments. As you rightly said, it does have these provisions which talk about exit, the board mechanism, basically the terms in connection with the investment of the transaction. That is what the basic framework of a term sheet is. Now, to segregate, your term sheet will have two sets of terms. One will be your basic terms of investments, which will set forth the investment amount that the investor is putting into the company, what valuation is the company raising this investment at, what is the nature of instrument that will be issued to the investor, and your basic terms like what shareholder related rights will the investor receive in this company pursuant to their investment. Your shareholder rights can be broken into your board seats, your observer rights, management and economic rights that an investor gets in the company in connection with their investment. Basically, the term sheet will touch upon all the rights, in brief. But again, the details, mechanisms which these rights will pan out will be detailed in your definitive documents. Now, say definitive documents as a part of a transaction, the investor always enter into two documents. One is your share subscription agreement, which will capture the rights which are set forth in the extreme left, which is the amount of investment, the shares which are being issued, and your representation warranties and indemnities which are given by the company to the investor in connection with their subscription to shares. So these provisions go into your share subscription agreement. The heads covered in the extreme right, which are your shareholder and management related rights, these are typically incorporated in a shareholders agreement, which is binding between the shareholders and the company. And then the rights which are set forth in the shareholders agreement are also incorporated in your articles of the association of the company to make it binding on the company as well. So now we'll break these terms into simpler to understand. So investment amount, typically your term sheet will mention if the investment amount is being invested in USD or INR, it will set out your round size and the percent pre and post money valuation of the company and the shareholding which the investor is looking to hold in this company after the round closes. Now, when we come to pre-money and post-money, would anyone want to take a crack at explaining what they know what a pre-money valuation is and a post-money valuation is?
Yeah. Hi, Akshay again. So, am I audible?
Yeah. Yes, you are, Akshay.
Okay, so pre-money valuation is the valuation of a company before any investor has invested a single penny in it. Post-money valuation is the valuation of the company after the investor has invested money in the company. Let's say that the value of a company is 10 crores today and investors decide that, okay, I'm willing to, invest 1 CR in the company. In that case, the post-money valuation would be 11 CR.
That's right, Akshay. So, we'll set forth an example here. If a company is looking to raise investment, but they're unable to ascertain what is a pre-money value or what valuation should they raise their investment. We'll explain it through an example. For instance, company A is looking to raise 5 crores from potential investors, and these investors want a 20% stake in the company in lieu of pumping in 5 crores. So the way in which the company can ascertain its pre-money valuation is first to understand what would be the post-money valuation of the company after investors invest 5 crores. So the simple math here is you will divide your which is 5 crores by the shareholding that incoming investors are looking to hold, percentage shareholding. So when you divide 5 crores by 20%, you will get 25 crores. We arrive at what is the post company. Now, once we know what the post money is, and we know the approximate amount that the investors are looking to invest in the company, we simply subtract the post money amount from the investment amount, and that will give you the pre-money valuation or the valuation at which the company should raise this 5 crores. Now, the next is nature of instrument, right? We've all heard about equity shares, about preference shares, and typically we've again seen these incoming investors ask for preference shares, ask for plain equity, or sometimes they take a combination of both equity and preference. So typically what happens, as the name suggests, preference shares, it gives you preferential rights over your equity shareholder of the company. Now, these preferential rights are basically equity shares, but it will always want the visibility or the right to vote on all matters which are placed before a shareholder. Now, to achieve that, that's when it's a nominal equity, because your preference shares only allows you to vote on matters which really impact or affect your rights, or vote on matters when a company goes into liquidation. So in order to be able to vote on all matters which are placed before a shareholders meeting, investors typically also subscribe to nominal equity. Now, under our Companies Act, as we all know, all private companies are governed by the Companies Act. The Ministry of Corporate Affairs, as we all know, earlier when the act came into force, granted certain exemptions to private companies to make it more, feasible for them to operate. So one of the exemptions that we granted for private companies was from the provision of the Companies Act, which only enabled preference shareholders to vote on matters which impact their or affect their rights. Now, the moment a private company seeks this or claims this exemptions under its articles of association, then a preference shareholder technically is entitled to vote on all matters which are placed at the shareholders meeting and not just those matters which directly impact their rights.
Just to add to what Ridhima is saying, because valuation ultimately becomes the key commercial sense from an investment perspective, there are certain things which one should be mindful of in terms of see, even if it's a resident investor, even if it's a non-resident investor, our statutes and the way they have been legislated upon, there is some sort of a valuation, a pricing norm rather, which the companies have to fulfill. So this pricing obligation, or rather the valuation norm, it stems from the Companies Act, it stems from also Foreign Exchange Management Act if you're looking to raise funds from a non-resident investor, and also from the Income Tax Act. So it's very important that when we are contemplating on the round size, we're contemplating on how much stake we're willing to give to the investor for their investment, we should be mindful of these pricing norms as well, as essentially the long and short of this pricing norm is that a company cannot issue shares lower than fair market value. So that fair market value is determined through a valuation report that can be taken by a registered merchant banker or a practicing CA. But in terms of there being a flexibility to actually issue shares at any price, that is of course not there in terms of a statute, and that issuance will basically be null and void. So from a company and from a promoter perspective, it's very important to be mindful of this key legal requirement as well, because it translates into a very significantly commercial point in that sense. Another very important aspect which founders, promoters, companies need to be mindful of is this whole construct of representations and warranties, and the indemnities which follow if there is a breach of representations and warranties. Now, in any standard definitive document, as Ridhima mentioned, there are two that we enter into. One is the shareholders agreement, which will set out our the inter se rights between the members of the company, between the investors of the company, and of course, any obligations from a company perspective or from a promoter perspective as well. When we look at the share subscription agreement, that is where your investment terms actually are set out in terms of a binding contract. Now, any investor investing money in a company will also want to ensure that the company is in a stable position. It's a proper functioning company. Everything is in order. When the shares are issued to the investor for the investment amount that he's putting in, those shares have a valid title. They've been properly issued. They've been properly authorized by the shareholders of the company, by the board of the company. So all in all, the idea is when the investor is putting in money, they want contractual protections as well. Now, these are normally taken under the SSA, where the rights will come in, which we'll discuss in the next slide. But from a share subscription agreement perspective, a very ticking point becomes these warranties and negotiation on indemnities. Now, to simply put, fundamental warranties are your basic title warranties, the fact that company and the promoters can execute this agreement, can perform their obligations set out under the agreement. And more often than not, even the fact that there are no litigations or orders which sort of restrict the company and the promoters to fulfill their obligations. Now, when it comes to business warranties, these, as the name suggests, these essentially are generic business warranties. These can range from from IPR to financial statements to tax warranties to employment related warranties. So anything apart from standard issuance fundamental warranties essentially form a part of the bucket of business warranties. Now the effect of this is in terms of fundamental warranties and company business warranties being given. And these are typically, and this also becomes a very important negotiation point from a promoter perspective and a company perspective. The SSA, the share subscription agreement, should ensure that the warranties are basically given on the date of execution, and they're only repeated in that sense on the date of closing. By closing, I mean the date when actually investor is putting in the money in the company. One should absolutely avoid these warranties being repeatedly given on each day between execution and completion of the transaction. So this is one protection which our agreements for sure must have. The other one is, of course, just the act of representing and warranting something does not give the investor that satisfaction. They also cover their base in the sense that they want to know what happens when there's a breach of these representations and warranties. And that's where the indemnity kicks in, which mostly is the main fighting point between lawyers for sure. Now, in terms of indemnity, the basic concept is that you're making good the loss caused by the other party. Now, in this case, the loss will be to the investor, or maybe to the investor, because they've invested money in the company on certain presumptions, on a premise that everything is in order. Now, if that fundamental aspect is breached, the investor obviously will look to ensure that the money which is lost by the investor because of this investment is made good by the company and the promoters. Now, it seems, and it on paper, it is of course a major exposure if an event arises. But in terms of a monetary exposure, this of course opens the door on the company and the promoters that there may be a possibility that they have to indemnify the investor. But it's not as blanket as that. And that's why it's very important that the share subscription agreement has enough contractual protections to ensure that that indemnity exposure is not absolute. Now, from a very basic standpoint, one must ensure that when the company and the promoters are onboarding or undertaking the obligation to indemnify, that should only be limited to direct losses which are incurred by the investor. The investor should not come to the company tomorrow to say that, okay, because I've invested in your company, I've suffered a reputational loss, or my goodwill is damaged because XYZ things happened in the company. So it's imperative that the SSA, and by the SSA I mean the share subscription agreement, that clearly categorizes that losses can only be direct losses, and that's where the indemnity will trigger in. In terms of claiming that loss, of course, there has to be an actual loss. We should also insist from a company and a promoter perspective that the company and the promoters will not indemnify if it's a contingent liability. That loss actually has to materialize. The second possible protection in the SSA that can be added is time gaps. Right now, the investor is obviously is investing in the company, thinking of a longer horizon in that sense, right? Maybe a 5-year horizon or a 7-year horizon. So the idea is, do we want to keep our exposure open for that long? We should, of course, push back on that. But in terms of pushing back, in terms of timelines, one can obviously, for a business warranty, because it sort of ties into the statutory period of limitation, you tie in the business warranty to at max 3 years. So essentially what the agreement will say is that if there is a claim for a breach of business warranties after 3 years, the company and the promoters will not indemnify for that loss. This is also prevalent. Normally, investors also sort of carve out tax warranties from the business warranty bucket because tax is governed by a separate statute. There may be different statutory period of limitations, which there are. So normally tax warranties are then limited or subject to the statutory period of the basically, and it's linked to the time duration during which the department, the income tax department, can come and raise claims and notices on that party. So you link the time cap of more often than not, no investor will accept a time limitation on fundamental warranties because those are extremely critical for the investor. It's a title issue for them. So essentially, the shares that they're holding, they need to be properly and duly issued. Now, the best way to ensure that there is no possible exposure at a later date from again a company and a promoter perspective is that when the company is issuing shares to the investors, it's done in a proper manner, it's done in accordance with the Companies Act, and there are no loopholes or non-compliances to that effect. The other way to, again, an added step to limit the indemnity exposure is monetary caps. You can always limit, say, indemnity in terms of a business, in terms of a breach of business warranty to say that, okay, the company will not indemnify for more than 1x of the investment amount. That is a more accepted norm. You can also have certain thresholds like a de minimis threshold or a basket threshold, where essentially the obligation to indemnify only kicks in if the loss suffered by the investor exceeds that particular threshold amount. So that monetary wise, there is one added protection as well, which the promoters and the company can consider adding in their SSAs. The fourth one is we should ensure that if there are any a factual deviation in that sense from a warranty perspective, that should be disclosed to the investor. There is a concept of a disclosure letter under the SSAs, which enables the company and the promoters to disclose that factual deviation to the investor. So essentially, and this is prior to the execution and this is prior to the closing date. So the idea is the investors are then aware and they're knowingly walking into the investment. So tomorrow they can't take that ground that, okay, we were not aware that this is happening with the company. Again, in terms of negotiating on the warranties, one can always add suitable qualifiers, something as basic as instead of a representation saying that the company is compliant with all applicable laws, the best possible qualifier in this case is to say that the company is in compliance with all material applicable laws. So that sort of narrows the exposure for the promoters. Lastly, there can also be a waterfall which can be built into the SSA. Waterfall means essentially that the promoters will not be personally liable. At the first instance, the investors should raise a claim to the company. If the company, for whatever reason, is unable to indemnify, then only that claim should come to the promoters. But to give a holistic perspective on this, investors typically argue and actually get away with it also on 2 points. One, if it's such a fundamental warranties, they want promoters also to indemnify for that. And number two, there's a fraud by the promoter, then of course they will want promoters to indemnify the investors as well. There is also a concept of specific indemnities, which is actually the true danger, and it's sort of linked to the due diligence which is conducted by the investor on the company before the investment. Now, these specific indemnities are absolutely absolute. There are no protections, contractual or otherwise, it can be built into the SSA. So it's imperative that from a compliance perspective, the company ensures that they are thorough with their compliances. There are no significant non-compliances at the company level from a law perspective.
Yeah, I am Prasad here. Just one question. You are asking representation and warranties in terms of the company and a promoter. So if I understand, company is a separate legal entity and promoters, do you mean by founders? And if so, then founders are how liable for such warranties and indemnity when the company is treated as a separate legal entity? If you can just educate us on that. I hope my question is clear.
Yes, Prasad. So see, the idea is that because the company is essentially being run by a promoter, right? They are the people who are taking day-to-day actions, who are involved in the day-to-day management of the company. So the idea is when the investor is investing money in the company, they're doing it on the basis of the promoter per se, right? As you mentioned, the company is a legal entity only. It's actually being run by the minds of the promoters and the expertise of the promoters. So there is a significant amount of discomfort. One can obviously negotiate. There's no harm in trying to say that, okay, promoters will not indemnify or will not back the warranties which are being given by the company. But that definitely will create a significant amount of bad taste in investors' mouth, and it will create a significant amount of discomfort for them. If the promoters are not willing to back factual statements being given by the company, then there's something wrong, or there may be something wrong, right? So in terms of, and if this also enables the investors to have two recourses essentially, right? So while the promoter and the company would have to indemnify double, the indemnity amount will still remain the same. But for an investor, they still have two options to go to. The company, but say, for example, the company has no money, if it's almost on the verge of being insolvent, then they also want a recourse against the promoters as well, because essentially the money was pumped in relying on the promoter's worth.
But how far this is valid for a startup who is hardly in an angel round or something? Because when he's looking for money to raise his business, and if there is what kind of a penalty in terms of indemnity or warranties, so how far it is eligible, or what you can say applicable to a startup who is very early round, is hardly has passed from the grants to a pre-seed or an angel, and hardly is having a money, and a business is not even a very matured stage. So how is the perspective keeping early stage, or rather I will not early stage in terms of investment terms, a very initial stage of a business, and vis-a-vis these indemnities and warranties?
So see, essentially, okay, practically speaking, see, at an angel level or a pre-seed level, normally, more often than not, actually, these warranties and indemnities are not taken, because the angels are generally aware that it's a company which is starting its operations per se, right? In terms of even factually confirming statements, it may not really be relevant if the operations only have not started in full force. Now, when we talk about these warranties and indemnities, we're talking more from a PE investment or a VC investment. And by VC, I mean maybe a Series A, a Series B round. And of course, a pre-Series 1 as well. But depending on where the company is at, if it's normally the early angel investors actually just invest money through corporate processes. There are in terms, I mean, maybe there may be a term sheet, but in terms of proper, fully negotiated share subscription agreements or shareholder agreements, that may not always be the case, right? Because the people putting in that seed money know that that money is actually genuinely to boost and help the company. But it becomes difficult to negotiate and come out of this obligation as the company progresses and raises subsequent funding as well from PE funds, VC funds, etc.
Thanks for clarification. As I understand, this is more applicable into the series rounds rather than a initial rounds where the company is building up. Thanks for it.
We'll move on then.
All right. Now, in part, this is where we're talking about interstate shareholder rights, which are typically captured in your shareholders agreement. Now, an investor who is, investing in the company would need certain protections as a shareholder to ensure that, its investment is not really tanking. Basically, if you want to know, because as Gauri rightly mentioned, right, they are putting this money in the company basis the founder. So they would want some visibility on how these founders are actually running the company. Now, how they get these, how they protect themselves is by, trying to get a board seat, get a representative of the board. So typically, your PVC investors mostly will always seek a right to nominate their nominee on the board. Now, given they are a fund, a financial investor, they will always ensure that their nominee on the board is a non-executive director. Now, when we say a non-executive director, which basically means, their nominee on the board will not be in charge of day-to-day operations of the business. That will be done by the founders or the directors nominated by the founder of the board. Now, to ensure that their director, given he's a non-executive director, is not really, made part of any notices that the company receives from any governmental authority, or if they receive a notice, even as a non-executive director, they are not held liable. How they typically protect themselves is they will contractually call themselves out as non-executive directors. Second is, if we see the Companies Act also provides, a protection to or allows the company to indemnify a non-executive directors for actions taken by the company in contravention of the Companies Act. So they typically seek that indemnity protection from you. And the third way is, as we're all aware of, there's something called a directors and officers liability insurance. So they ensure that the company and the promoters obtain this insurance policy for their non-executive nominee director of the board, so that tomorrow, if any authority, makes them party to any notice or sends them on investigation or any kind of non-compliance notice to the company where their directors are named, they have protection under this directors and officers liability insurance policy. So that's one right that an incoming investor, typically seeks. The other is an observer right. So it works as a permission combination. Some investors will ask for both a director seat and the right to nominate an observer on the board. And then depending on, the situation, they may exercise both the rights or they may only exercise an observer right. And another combination is they simply seek for an observer right. Now, as the name suggests, an observer is a person who's only observing the board meeting. So as opposed to a director on the board, an observer typically does not have voting rights. They're just observing the meeting for the investor on the board. While they have the right to speak, they don't really have the right to vote on that meeting. And they are not considered to constitute valid quorum as opposed to a director that you would see. So some investors, depending on their appetite, they just seek for an observer right, where this individual that they nominate on the board observes the board meeting and basically reports back to the investor, letting them know what decisions or resolutions were passed at a board meeting. The other set of rights that investors, and this is again more in the later stages of investment, you won't only see it in an angel round. The other set of protections that investors seek are what we call veto matters, what we call reserve matters. Now, again, given that they are while they do not want to officially hinder the way in which a founder runs the business, but again, they don't want the founder to have a free hand to run the business as the founder deems fit, because that impacts their investment in the company. How they protect themselves in such a situation is they typically seek for a set of matters which are called veto matters. And the examples that we stated here are shared issuances because they want to have visibility as in when company issues shares because that results in a dilution for the investor. If the company goes on and takes borrowing from financial institutions, that's where the investor will want to have visibility. Likewise, if they are changing the line of business of the company, they are entering into a strategic alliance or a joint venture or creating a subsidiary. Strategic matters is where a financial investor typically seeks veto rights. Now, how these veto rights work is, for instance, today the company wants to before the company can place this matter before a board meeting and a shareholders meeting, contractually the company will first have to go to the investor, inform the investor that they are looking to raise funds from XYZ party, give them a notice. Only once the investor who has this veto right, a reserve matter, gives their consent to the reserve matter, to the share issuance, can the company actually then go and place the matter before a board and a shareholder and proceed to issue shares to this incoming party. Now, if for instance, I as an investor have this reserve matter under the shareholders agreement, but the company first does not come to me to seek consent, but goes ahead and issues shares in breach of this provision of the SHA, then that share issuance will be considered as null and void on behalf of the company. Moving forward, the next set of rights that we typically see in shareholders agreements, which are sought by investors, is information rights and inspection rights. Now, as the company grows, it does raise investments from these, funds, institutional funds like your alternate investment funds and big players in the market. These funds have their internal reporting requirement. Basically, they need to inform their limited partners about the progress of their portfolio company. When they fulfill their internal requirements, it's by seeking information rights from their portfolio. Now, these information rights are typically your MIS. If there is a material litigation, any kind of litigation in the company which consequently would have an impact on their investment, details of that litigation is given to the investor. Then again, your quarterly financial statements, your unaudited financial statements. If the company has, if there is any event in the company which would materially impact their business, given that also has a bearing on their investment, you inform the investor about such events. So these are the typical information rights which a financial investor would seek from the company under the SHA. And the other is an inspection right, which, as we are all aware, even the Act allows all shareholders of the company to at least inspect the books and records of the company. So the inspection right that we typically see under the shareholders agreement allows investors to conduct an inspection of the books and records of the company. If the investor wants to, meet the key managerial personnel of the company to get some information about the company, this inspection right enables the investors to, inspect the books and also meet the key managerial personnel of the company. So the rights we spoke about in the last rights were mostly like management rights, which help the investors have an insight on how the business is operating. Now, these rights that we're going to discuss are mostly we can call shareholder or economic related rights, which help the investors protect their investment. Now, the first right that we talk about is a preemptive right. Now, a preemptive right basically allows the investor to participate in a new funding round in order to be able to maintain their shareholding. Now, so that the company is looking at raising new capital, this right will, obligate the company and the promoters to first go to their existing investors, give them an option to infuse that capital in the company. If the investors are not interested in infusing that capital and are commercially acceptable towards dilution, then the company can raise this funds from third party. So that's the preemptive right. And this preemptive right is typically provided to investors on a pro rata basis. So basically equivalent to their shareholding in the company. Moving forward, now the next is an anti-dilution right. As the name suggests, it's a right that allows the investors to protect their dilution. Now, how this works is, if tomorrow the company is raising capital from a third party, but at a price per share which is less than the price at which the existing investor infused capital in the money, that's what we call a down round. Then in that situation, the company needs to get these existing investors. Now, how this typically works is there are two formulas that or two mechanisms that we've seen for an anti-dilution protection. One is called a broad-based weighted average formula, and the other is a full ratchet. Now, the most commonly seen practice which is adopted by companies is your broad-based weighted average mechanism for an anti-dilution, because this impacts all shareholders across the cap table equally. So that's so from a founder's perspective, a broad-based weighted average formula is very beneficial. Whereas an investor would typically want the full ratchet. Now, in full ratchet, it's actually the founders which take a hit to give a protection to investors. So as time has progressed and investments have evolved, even investors are now comfortable accepting a broad-based weighted average formula because it impacts everyone holistically across the cap table. Now, if a down round happens, there are multiple ways in which a broad-based weighted average or anti-dilution protection can basically be provided to an investor. For instance, you can adjust the conversion ratio of the preference shares. You can issue new shares to the investor at nominal price. In some instances, if the above options are not available, promoters at times agree to transfer some of their shares to the investor. But the most commonly followed practice is to adjust the conversion ratio. So, for instance, when shares or preference shares is first issued to an investor, typically it's issued with a conversion ratio of 1:1. So, one preference shares will convert into one equity share. Now, if a down round happens, in order to provide protection for this investor who's been impacted by the down round, the way it works is the conversion ratio will change to say a 1:1.2, 1.1. Basically, it allows you to get additional equity shares at the time of conversion of your CCPS without actually having to infuse more capital in the company. That's how your conversion ratio adjustment works. And the reason this is more typically followed is also from the perspective of a foreign investor. Now, as we all know, when a non-resident entity invests in a resident entity, there are valuation norms, as Gauri mentioned initially, right? And FEMA is very clear: a non-resident entity cannot subscribe to shares below fair market value. That is why an anti-dilution protection, where we say that one of the mechanisms will be to issue shares at nominal price to the CCPS holder, typically does not work for a non-resident investor because they really can't subscribe to shares below fair market value. While we contractually provide for this, typically the protection is given by adjusting your conversion ratio. Moving forward, again, since an investor is investing capital on the basis of the promoter, they typically impose certain transfer restrictions on the promoter to ensure that so long as they are invested in the company, and investors typically look for a 5 to 7 year horizon in any portfolio company. They would want the promoters to continue with the company, continue running the operations, because it's the founder's mind. Founder knows how to run the business. They have the know-how. So in order to protect their investment, they typically impose certain transfer restrictions on the founders. We first talk about that. Now, again, there are various permutation combinations in which they impose transfer restrictions on the founder. First, we'll touch upon the lock-in. So, how the lock-in is structured, and there are two ways of structuring it. Investors typically want the promoter to be locked into the company till the time they hold shares in the company, or till the time they get an exit, which is the same. So they impose a lock-in. Now, lock-in can be structured in two ways. A, there's a 100% lock-in, but the founder is not at all allowed to transfer their shares in the company. The other is they provide a lock-in for a small period, and there's something called a vesting schedule. How that works is the way it will work is that when the closing happens, right, the day on which the investor puts money into the company and they are allotted their shares, they will allow the founders to hold 25%. So of the 100% shares that the founder holds, the way the vesting will work is they will release 25% of, typically 25%. They allow the founders to hold in the company, and the balance 75 they subject it to a lock-in, and the way that lock-in works is percentage of the share keeps getting vested on the promoter over a period of time. So typical examples that we've seen is they allow the promoters to hold 25% upfront, and the balance 75% they will stagger over a say 3 to 4 year period, and they allow monthly vesting. So every month a portion of that 75% will keep getting vested in the promoter over a period of 4 years. So this is one restriction, transfer restriction that they impose on founders. The other is that now for the shares that are vested on the founder, if the founder wants to transfer those shares to a third party, we've all heard this word called ROFO, right of first refusal. So there's a ROFO, there is a ROFO. An investor will always insist for a right of first refusal over a promoter share transfer, because what that means is a third party to whom the founder wants to sell their shares has to determine the price. To break it down, how a ROFO will work is if tomorrow founder wants to transfer a part, dispose part of their shares, they will go out to the market. Investors who have a offer on them, they will give them the offer. Now, if the investor is willing to match that price and the investor matches that price, then the founder will be obligated to sell their shares to the investor. If the investor is not interested in exercising their right of first refusal, they will reject it, and the founder will be entitled to go sell their shares to the third party. This is a right of first refusal. Now, when we say a ROFO, a right of first offer, the reason why investors are not very comfortable with a right of first offer is because that right requires them to determine the price, fetch the price at which they would want to buy the promoter's shares. So to avoid doing price determination, the investors prefer a ROFO as opposed to a ROFO. Now, along with the right of first refusal, founders are also subject to a tag-along right. Now, and a tag-along right comes in two combinations. One is a pro rata tag-along right, and one is a full tag-along right. Now, to break it, as an investor, if I have a right of first refusal on a founder share transfer, I decide not to exercise my right of first refusal. So while the promoter is entitled to go sell their shares to a third party, I as an investor have a tag along right. What that means is I have the right to tag along with the founder and sell my shares to a third party. Now, a pro rata tag works in a situation where a founder is selling nominal shareholdings. Is selling a nominal part of their shareholding. I, as an investor, will get a pro rata, which means whatever the founder is selling, pro rata my shareholding in the company, I get to tag along my shares. When we say a full tag comes into effect when on account of a founder transfer, there is a change in control of the company. Now, that change in control can be through shareholding, through board composition. Now, if a founder is selling such percentage, such number of his shares, which means 50% of the company is going to be held by the third party, or the third party buying the share is going to have the right to nominate majority directors on the board. That a change in control, which would then entitle the investor to sell all its shares held by it in the company to a third party. Now, one tricky thing for founders really in a change in control tag is that they will need to find such a buyer that is willing to not only buy their shares, but also buy shares of all those investors who have this tag along right. Because if the founder is unable to find a buyer who is willing to buy shares of all investors who have this tag along right, unfortunately the founder itself will be able to sell its shares to that third party. So this is one tricky point for a change in control tag. From a founder's perspective, keeping in mind this lock-in and the vesting and the transfer restrictions, as the company progresses, I mean not in the very initial stages of funding, but maybe founders typically negotiate for a liquidity basket. Now, what this liquidity basket means that so what this liquidity basket would typically mean is founders have the right to freely transfer a percentage of their shares to their affiliates for tax planning purposes. And this percentage of shares where they have liquidity will not be subject to any transfer restriction, be like the first refusal or the tag along. Now, typically, this percentage that we've seen, which investors agree to, range between a 5 to 10%, nothing beyond that, but a 5 to 10%.
We'll move on. So I think we're at the fag end. I know we're running out of time, so we'll quickly wrap this up. Another very critical right is the liquidation preference. Investor, this is an absolute right which an investor will always negotiate. The idea behind the liquidation right, as we normally call it, a liquidation preference right is essentially provides an assured return to the investors on the investments that they've put in the company. Now, this right only gets triggered if there's a liquidity event. That liquidity event can be a winding up or a dissolution of the company, or if the company is being sold or the assets of the company are being sold. And by assets, I mean substantial assets, core fundamental assets of the company are being sold. And the idea behind this is because it's such a major event occurring at the company level, the investors want an assured protection that if XYZ events occur, their monetary interests in the company is protected. Now, how is that panned out in the shareholders agreement is that investors will more often than not negotiate for a repref right, which is it's in a higher of construct. Essentially, it will either be the higher of the investment amount that they've put in, or it will be the higher of the pro rata percentage of the investor shareholding in the company. Now, by this, it means either if I've invested 100 rupees, either the investor will get a short 100 rupees, or if their pro rata participation in that liquidation proceeds because of their shareholding in the company is, say, 120 rupees, then they'll get a higher of benefit. And in this scenario, the investors will end up receiving 120 rupees instead of a 100 rupee liquidation preference payout. So this is one of the core economic rights that the investors will always look to have in their in the SHAs and the Articles of Association of the company. Now, of course, any financial investor changing to a seasoned PE fund is obviously putting in money to actually get an exit and get a return on that investment at a later date. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the typical horizons for an exit are 5 to 6 years from date of their investment. Right now, these exits can be structured in any way possible. The more common ones, which we've seen, which have been accepted across the board, are one is a qualified IPO. A qualified initial public offering, it can also be structured as a pure play initial public offer as well. A qualified IPO, why is it preferred in terms of investors is because it qualifies the IPO in terms of the per share price, that when the share is actually listed on a stock exchange, it will be either a 1x or a 2x or a 3x of a particular round price. So if that is not happening, then that qualified IPO will not take place, right? So because we can't, the agreements can't be limited to only one type of exit. There are normally 4 to 5 exit options set out in the agreements, in the SHAs and in the articles as well. Now, those other options can be a strategic sale as well, where substantially again the assets of the company are being sold, or there is a change of control at the company level. A strategic sale exit protection is then, or an exit mode is also extended to the investor. A third party sale, as the name suggests, the idea is there are obligations put on the company and the promoters to find a buyer, source a buyer who will buy the shares of the investors and get basically ensure that an investor has exited from the company. A more tricky one is a buyback of share, but that's normally taken out of the equation as the company progresses and there are subsequent rounds of because of standards issues. And even in terms of actually enforcing an exit through a buyback, there are so many restrictions in the Companies Act which sort of limit that pure play exit. It's a not very preferred exit option in that sense. Now, one core right, again, which an investor will always have in their shareholders agreement is a drag along right. In simple terms, a drag, and just to give context, a drag along right is a very severe critical right, which is only triggered in certain cases. Therefore, one must ensure that if a founder or a promoter or a company is seeing a drag along right, it should only be a consequence of certain actions and not that they exercise it at any given time as and when they deem fit. So a drag along right, essentially what it does is it gives the right and the power to the investor to initiate a sale where it will of course offload their own shares, but they can also drag all the promoters and all the other shareholders of the company and offload all that entire shareholding to that to whichever buyer this investor has found. So it's a very detrimental right in that sense from a founder and a company perspective. So it should always be qualified on the occurrence of a few events, right? So one major one being that, okay, there was an exit horizon, say of 5 years, and the company and the promoters are unable to secure an exit for the investor through the modes we've just and that exit horizon has lacked, still unable to provide exit, then yes, the investor will like to take matters in their own hand, and only then should a drag right be permitted to be triggered by the investor. So one must be very careful of this trigger event in the agreements per se. Likewise, and this has become a recent norm in that sense, these drag rights are also being triggered if there's a material breach at the company level. We'll briefly touch upon this as well in the next slide. Now, one very important obligation from a promoter perspective is non-compete and non-solicitation obligations. The idea in simple terms is to ensure that promoters are not engaging in competing businesses and they're not soliciting clients from the existing company. They're not soliciting employees from the existing company, and basically after inducing funds from the investors, they've gone ahead and opened a competing business and taken away the entire employee strength and the client strength. So the idea is to ensure that that chance or that event doesn't happen. So these non-compete and these non-solicit obligations are essentially set out in the shareholders agreement to ensure this investor protection as well. Now, from a promoter perspective, one must ensure that there are enough qualifications on this obligation, and by qualifications we mean that there can be a time cap in the sense that this obligation is not absolute. It is linked to the promoter's shareholding in the company. It is linked to the promoter's employment tenure in the company, and maybe 1 year after the termination or cessation of shareholding. One must also ensure that it's not an absurdly broad geographical limitation as well. It can be, because we're in India, it can be limited to the country of India and not a worldwide non-compete restriction, because the idea is not to ensure that promoters should just sit at home and not do anything after exiting from the company. So these non-compete, non-solicitation obligations must be looked at with a fine-tooth comb, and to ensure that these obligations actually don't hinder the interest of the promoters. Quickly moving on, event of default, as I mentioned, drag along rights are linked to these events of defaults as well. These are normally very critical events, should be related to the company, and it should not be that, okay, if a founder has been convicted of a criminal offense, then the investor can trigger a drag right or trigger an event of default right. The idea is, if the company is being impacted by the actions or the omissions of the founder, then only that event should be called out as an event of default. As I mentioned, investors normally in this case accelerate their exit rights. Then the whole exit horizon, etc., falls away. The investors essentially go to the promoters and ask them to give them an immediate exit, of course, within reasonable timelines. And investors then also can normally exercise their drag along rights as well. Another important concept which one should be mindful of is creation of ESOP pools. Investors will always insist that these ESOP pools either they're created or increased prior to investors putting in the money, because of course, if there's an ESOP pool creation at a time after the investors have put in money, they will start diluted. Accepted norm in any PVC transaction. Due diligences become a very critical point for especially Series A, Series B, and onward funding rounds. Angel investors normally do not conduct due diligences, but there can be exceptions as well. These due diligences are on the company to ensure that it's legally compliant, it's financially sound. And if it's a deep tech company, there are investors who sort of prefer to conduct tech diligences as well. Now, in terms of going back to the term sheet, because that's what we're discussing, there is also a very important obligation on the promoters and the company, which is put in the term sheet in terms of exclusivity. So one should always be mindful of that. If you are in talks with a potential investor, that investor will always put an exclusivity obligation on the promoters and the company, that the promoters and the company should not go and sort of close another transaction with another investor, or basically start any kind of discussions in relation to a potential funding round in the company when the promoters in the company are also already engaged in an existing discussion. I think that is it from our end. If there is time, I'm not sure, we can address a few queries. If you guys want to reach out to us separately, we'll be happy to address queries that way as well. Whatever works for everyone.
Just one question. You mentioned about the ESOP pool. How about the optional pool? Does it mean the same? Point number one. And point number two, there is one sentence you written that the ESOP can be given to the promoters if it's a startup, if I read properly. So when we say a founder is already having his share, then beside that he can have the ESOP. These are the two questions.
Right. So yes, Prasad, I think when we mentioned ESOP pools, we meant the employee stock options which can be granted to employees. In terms of promoter holding, being granted ESOPs, that is not allowed under the Companies Act. ESOPs can only be granted to employees of a company who are not promoters. The only one exception is basically where the company is a registered startup with DPIIT. In that, and that also for 10 years. Only in that particular case can ESOPs be granted to promoters. There is one more way, but that's typically undertaken quite late into the life cycle of a company, where promoters step down as promoters of a company and they're reclassified as founders. And the idea is by then the company has become a professionally managed company because of so many financial investors being on board. That's when one can possibly structure a grant of ESOP to a founder. But in terms of the Companies Act, because a promoter is a recognized term under law, and there's a clear-cut restriction under the Companies Act that ESOPs cannot be granted to promoters. So the pool and the scheme must ensure that compliance as well.
And as you said about the exit opportunities, since we all are startups right now who are attending this session, so can you educate more us about the BSc startup and BSc SME? At least what is the difference, and do we graduate from a BSc SME to a BSc IPO, or how it happens, whether we have to go for a BSc SME or BSc startup and then graduate to main BSc? I hope I could put my query in a right perspective.
So I'm not clear, are we saying from a startup you qualify to work?
When you talk of the exit option as a qualified IPO,
yes.
So in that case, when we are saying a IPO, we normally talk of a BSc. However, now there are options of a BSc SME as well as a BSc startup.
Yeah.
So what is a logical step for a startup for IPO?
So see, it depends on where the company is at that relevant time. Right, Prasad? So if it is, say, an MSME at that particular stage, there is okay, I'll spin it the other way. The idea for the investor is to get an exit and get an exit at a good price, right? Which will give them a return on their investment. Now, there is no coded formula as to how much the investor is looking at to get a return. But the idea is if it's listing on a stock exchange, and that can be a BSC or an NSC as well, or an MSME stock exchange as well, from an investor perspective, they will look at to ensure that there is a price protection. Ultimately, where the company is getting listed at, it is of course a commercial call which will have to be undertaken at that relevant point in time between the promoters, between the investors. Of course, everyone has to be on board, because if the investors don't agree to that particular exit mechanism, in any case, the company will not be able to provide an exit through that way. But in terms of keeping an option open, yes, depending on where the company is at, there are conventional stock exchanges which are NSE, BSE, and there are of course the new platforms where one can list as well.
Hello. Hello. Yes, ma'am. My name is Hardik. Am I audible? Hello.
Hi. Yes.
Yeah, ma'am. My question is that regarding ESOPs, like generally I have heard that ESOP is like when an employee stays with the company for 3 years or 5 years, then the granting and vesting period starts. But my question is that can we allot the ESOP pool, or can we make a policy, ESOP policy based on the performance or the link it to KPI of the employees?
Yes, Hardik, you can do that. So, the vesting period is typically determined by the company. So every ESOP policy, every company will have a different ESOP policy. It's nowhere hard coded that you will only be eligible for ESOPs after you continue for you render 3 years services in the company. Now, an ESOP policy, when a company prepares, they have their own terms and conditions, right? One of the conditions is yes, you should be in continuous employment with the company in order to be eligible to be entitled to that. So I don't see we don't see a challenge here where it has to be minimum 3 to 5 years.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Should I go next?
Show me.
Yeah. So we are in process of hiring a co-founder, or rather, he has been working with us, and we are going to get into a discussion of allocation of equity to him. So what are the best practices generally we will have to keep in mind while we are executing this process?
So I think you're allocating fresh equity shares.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, do we have to issue new shares in the company and then allocate him, or from the existing one we have to allocate the shares? I mean, what do we do?
So need one question before we answer your question actually. Do you have investors on board already, or
No,
on?
we are bootstrapped.
Okay, so yeah, so see, you can do it either way. You can existing founders can also part ways with their some percentage of their share. The incoming founder can of course buy these shares from the existing founders. You can also do a fresh issuance, but of course you'll have to be mindful of the fact that it will dilute the existing founders in that case.
Okay. And how do the vesting period basically, I mean, how do the vesting formula works in case of we have to link it to the performance or some KPIs or milestone? Then how does that really work?
So you're talking about the vesting from a ESOP perspective, right?
We can't hear you, ma'am.
So when you are asking particular co-founder or hello.
Hello. No, I think at least I can't hear you.
Yeah, the voice is breaking intermittently many times during the program also, ma'am, earlier also. But somehow we have been managing. No issue.
So this question on vesting, is this again related to the same co-founder question? Hello.
Ma'am, if you are speaking, we can't hear you anything.
Just allow us a minute.
Okay. Okay.
Can you hear us now? Is this better?
Yeah, it is much better.
Okay. So Mihir, the question was when you're asking about vesting, Are you looking at structuring vesting of shares to that new co-founder, or is this a question on an ESOP plan or a scheme?
No, so the question is basically, we are, as explained, there is an incoming co-founder, for which we have to set some milestones and define some KPIs, which has to be linked with the allocation of equity. So what is the best practice in that?
For me, the way you can structure it is first, onboard him as an employee of the company. In his employment agreement, you can have certain milestones or performance-based standards which he needs to fulfill. And once those milestones are achieved, you can then have shares either fresh issued to him or the existing founders transfer. Hello.
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Okay. Are there any further questions?
Ma'am, I think there is a problem with the audio. I don't know only if it is with me, but there's a problem with the audio for sure.
So, Mihir, to answer your question, the way to structure it, is it audible now, Mihir?
Yeah, but it is breaking away, it.
We've connected to another network. Is this better?
Yeah, much better, much better.
Okay.
So, to me, to answer your question, the way you can structure this is first onboard this new incoming co-founder as an employee of the company, have an employment agreement with this co-founder, which will set out certain performance matrix milestones to be achieved. And once these milestones are achieved by the co-founder, you can then allocate shares to the founder. As discussed earlier, this allocation can be through a fresh issuance, or the existing founders can offload some of their shares.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Most welcome.
Any further questions? Anybody?
Yeah, Anshika, this details about the masterclass. What is that on 17th, 18th? How it will happen and who will participate?
Sir, can you repeat the question, please?
No, I just want to know, ma'am, regarding the masterclass. No, it was mentioned in that which will happen on 17th, 18th April. No, who are all the participants and how we come to know?
Sir, you will get an emailer from the team about the masterclass, and all the details will be mentioned in the same.
Okay, ma'am. Is it offline or online?
Online.
Okay.
All the masterclasses that has happened are online and will carry on the weights.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Yes.
Can we get the recordings of this sessions because we missed some part of it?
Yes, sir. It will be shared in the mail with the feedback form.
I had
Okay.
a question.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello.
Hi, we can hear you. Yeah,
Yeah, can you hear me?
we can.
Yeah, I have a question. Suppose you are at a stage where you are just investing and you have not raised much, I mean, the revenue is not substantial. In that case, is there any thumb rule to do the valuation?
See, normally there are valuation methodologies, and when you approach a valuer, they will take into account the status of your operations. And they also take into account any potential. I mean, revenue coming into the company, right? So, I mean, it can be the case that as of today, there are being with potential clients which are of substantial value. So the valuer will take into account all those elements when they value the company. But in terms of there being a thumb rule or a hard and fast rule, there is none as such to our best understanding. There are factors which are taken into account by that valuer when they value the company, and that will include the company's projections as well. So maybe today there may not be a big enough revenue, but if there's a projected number, then to our understanding, that valuer will take that into account as well.
Okay, sure. So when will we come to know whether we are shortlisted for your cohort that you had announced, which we had applied for?
Ma'am, it will be notified shortly.
Oh, all right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Corey and Ms. Ridhima, for the enlightening discussion. We want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for the wonderful learning experience your masterclass provided. I want to thank you both taking this time and making the effort to attend the session.
Thanks, Anshika. Thanks for having us. And thank you again to the great audience. Bye.
Thank you so much for all the partners and participants for your presence. We'll see you in the next masterclass. Thank you.